welcome to the New Orleans History Podcast. I'm your host, Rob. The Faubourg Marigny was the second suburb of New Orleans. So the original settlement of New Orleans is what is now known as the French Quarter, around Jackson Square. There was a military encampment, and all the institutions, the church and state and everything, government, were in the French Quarter. So the word Faubourg means false city. So what that means is that it's not a real city with a government and church and all that stuff. There may be a church there, but it's not a central church that is a governing body. And so the Faubourg, we now usually call, and the English word for that we use is not an exact translation of false city, but we call it suburb. So the Faubourg was the second suburb. The first suburb was what's now known as the Central Business District. And the Faubourg Marigny was originally inhabited by people who couldn't afford to live in the central city, what we call the French Quarter. So they would be more workers, blue-collar people like carpenters and plumbers and other kinds of service people. And the houses that they built were shotgun houses, and that became a problem later on in the 50s and 60s. The Faubourg became depopulated because young families did not want to live in a shotgun house. The young families wanted to have some. Young families were okay. I mean, when you just had a couple of babies and a wife and a husband, then a shotgun house was okay. But as you got to be a larger family, you had different generations, then they wanted more privacy. And so they didn't want somebody walking through the room every time they had to go to the bathroom or go to the kitchen. So the Faubourg became depopulated in the 50s and 60s, and you can see the census figures, and it lost, several thousand people a decade. And then after Katrina, which was in 2005, Hurricane Katrina that everyone's familiar with, people who came down here to, quote, help, unquote, to help New Orleans rebuild itself, they were looking for a place to live, and they found the shotgun houses in Katrina to be quite charming. And so they moved into them and they fixed them up. And so the Faubourg Marigny is now a very expensive place to live, expensive place to buy a house, and an expensive place to rent an apartment, because it's very close to the center of things, if you consider the center of things the French Quarter. And if you're working in the CBD, it's just on the other side of the French Quarter, so you can easily get there by driving or by taking a bus, or even walking if you're a pretty good walker. So the interesting thing about the Faubourg from one point of view is the entertainment district that's developed there. So there is a street called Frenchmen Street, and it is now eclipsing Bourbon Street as an entertainment district, because Bourbon Street is kind of tawdry, with the strippers and the emphasis on sex. A lot of tourists in the modern day are not looking for sex. They have all the sex they can handle with their own life and their own wife and their own girlfriends or whatever they have going on. They're not looking for strippers, and they're not looking for topless dancers and all this sort of thing. So the big draw of Bourbon Street is not such a big draw anymore. And what people who visit New Orleans want now is live music. And Frenchmen Street and the Faubourg Marigny is a very good place for that. On any evening, there are about 10 different venues that are providing live music. Some of them charge money for admission. Some of them charge for dinner. They expect you to come in and eat dinner there, and then you get music as a kind of bonus. And other ones are just have live music, and you can walk in and you don't even have to buy a drink. You can just walk in and dance to the music and hang around as long as you want, and there's nobody to make you buy a drink. If you want a drink, you have to go to the bar and request one. So it's a wonderful street for people who love live music, and the bands are very high standard, very high quality there, and the bonus is that they're usually danceable music. That's something that they take into account, that people want to dance, and so they play songs that are danceable. And interestingly, the intro music to this podcast today is a band that plays on Frenchmen Street called the New Orleans Jazz Vipers. And so if you go down on Frenchmen Street, you can hear them live. And you can go back to the beginning of this podcast and you'll be able to hear what they sound like. The standard of music is very high in New Orleans. There's a musicians union, and you can, if you are a recording artist, you can find all the sidemen you need here. A lot of famous people have recorded down here, have recorded albums down here. A lot of them used to record at a place called C. Saint, which was run by a famous composer and musician, Allen Toussaint, who's passed away a couple of years ago. But that was a big recording studio, and he had access to all the best musicians in New Orleans, and they would come out there and they would sometimes jam. There's a famous recording of Robert Palmer called Sneakin' Sally Through the Alley, that the backup band is the Meters, and it really introduced the Meters to the world because that was a big hit. If you walk around the Faubourg Marigny, you'll find a lot of beautiful houses. I mentioned that the shotgun house was a common, the most common form of architecture there. There's also these people that have moved there since Hurricane Katrina often take what's called a double shotgun, where previously two families would have lived there side by side, and they take out the interior walls and they make it into a single house, and that allows you to live in the house without having to walk through the room to go to the bathroom and go to the kitchen. It allows you to have some privacy. You can have side rooms that you can shut off, and nobody would walk through them. There's also an architectural feature common in New Orleans, which also exists in the Faubourg Marigny, which is the camelback. And in a camelback, you have a shotgun house, but in the back of the house, there's a raised portion, a second story, and that was for the young men of the house to entertain females. They would have a separate entrance in the back, and they could bring females in at all hours of the day and night, and not disturb the main family. And that was an accepted practice, that young men needed to have female company, and that they didn't need to show those women off to the grannies and their mom and their dad, and they could just bring them in and take them out and have their own little space to entertain them. A lot of artists live in the Faubourg Marigny, and the adjacent neighborhood is called Bywater. And now between the Faubourg Marigny and Bywater, there's a huge artistic community now, and there are galleries, and there are sculptures on the street, and they're very creative businesses that approach things like bakeries in a unique way, and so you can find a lot of interesting venues in the Faubourg Marigny and in the adjacent neighborhood called Bywater, which I may talk about in a subsequent podcast. But it's really, the Faubourg Marigny and Bywater are really kind of a unit. The unfortunate thing about the Faubourg Marigny and Bywater is the crime, because when you go across, if you look at a map and you see something called St. Bernard Avenue is on the border of the Faubourg Marigny, and across that street is something called the 7th Ward. That's one of the worst neighborhoods in New Orleans, and there's a lot of crime there, and unfortunately the criminals from the 7th Ward come over to the Faubourg Marigny. A famous incident that was well publicized in New Orleans was that these criminals would put poles up in the Faubourg Marigny and in Bywater that looked like a place that you could attach your bicycle. You could lock your bicycle up, and you would lock your bicycle up, and then they would come along and pull the pole up out of the ground and take your bicycle. And in fact, if you park your bicycle for 5 minutes outside of, say, a grocery store in the Faubourg Marigny, and you do not secure it, there's a good chance that it'll be gone when you come back out. So the crime is a big problem there, and people are actually mugged on the street and tourists held up. And that also happens in the French Quarter. The crime is really a problem in New Orleans, and it hasn't really been addressed very well by the authorities. The typical response time for New Orleans Police Department is 4 hours, by which time everybody's dead or enough bleeding on the side of the road. And the paramedics in this town say that they're the ones that have to clean up the mess when the cops don't come, and then there's just a guy sitting on a curb bleeding through his scalp. So if you visit the Faubourg Marigny at night, as long as you stay in the touristy parts of it, Frenchman Street would be fairly safe, but you should exercise caution about wandering around in other parts of the Faubourg Marigny and Bywater. In the daytime, you should be fairly safe, but as I said, if you have a bicycle, be very careful where you secure it. That's all I'm going to say about the Faubourg right now. I'll probably talk about it in a future program. Thank you for listening.
Each night I pray, no one's gonna take my sweet Lorraine away.